Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to discuss today is love and hate in a new American society for America's new industrial age. And along the way, we're going to meet a giant lady made out of copper. We're going to explore these huge new American cities and watch some of them burn to the ground. We're going to meet the infamous dead rabbits of New York City, and we're going to marry off the dollar princesses of America. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head. So put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we continue to build an answer to that question right there. America's industrial age, golden, gilded, or dark. Evaluate the historical events between 1860 and 1920 in terms of society, politics, and the economy, and develop an argument that supports one of these three interpretations for this critical period in American history. Now, last time we talked about what exactly the Industrial Revolution was and all the problems it created. But whatever the problems of the Industrial Revolution, and there were like a lot of problems, whatever those problems were, it worked. The Industrial Revolution produced vast amounts of American wealth. I mean, look at the U.S. Industrial Index in the red square right there. Massive. It increases almost by tenfold. There is a constant demand for workers in these factories. There is a constant demand for that sweet, sweet money. I mean, look there on the lower left. Look at the increase of the American economy. It is fantastic. America's factories needed workers. Now, driven by both internal increase and large-scale immigration from Europe, those workers showed up. The American population explodes during this period, tripling in a single 50-year period. Again, look at that, the information in the red box. It's almost a straight geometric line. Yet the majority of these new Americans, especially the new immigrants, didn't spread out across the countryside like immigrants had done in the 18th or early 19th centuries. Instead, they concentrated in the cities. And you can see there at the balance of the rural and the urban population, even the workers from the American countryside flood in to these huge new cities that began to form around factories and around this huge and massive influx of population, this influx of immigration. These new immigrants are something that America had never seen before. Generally, the immigrants of the 18th and early 19th century were coming from the British Isles or Africa. But these new immigrants are coming from very different parts of Europe. Originally, they're mostly coming from Ireland and Germany, but after the Civil War, this begins to shift in favor of Southern and Eastern Europe. Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, the Ukraine. Now, these are areas that were racked with war, oppression, and violence in the late 19th century. And those people wanted to leave. To these 19th century immigrants, America was this promised land, a refuge of opportunity and peace. And it might not be great working for 11 hours a day in a Chicago meatpacking plant, but it was better than getting chased around by Cossacks in Imperial Russia. I mean, and that's why so many Jewish refugees fled, because of the virulent anti-Semitism of Russia. At any rate, these people show up and they are more than willing to work for very long hours for very little pay. In fact, that's one of the main reasons that wages remained so depressed during the entire late 19th centuries, this constant influx of immigration. And one of these immigrants shows up in 1848, a penniless 12-year-old Scottish boy named Andrew Carnegie. Stick a pin in that name, because that name's going to pop up later. And many of those immigrants flooded into the United States' largest port, New York City. And in New York City, immigrants were processed at Ellis Island. And Ellis Island processed a fantastic number of immigrants. 9 million immigrants go through that building entering the United States. It completely overwhelms the legal framework that the United States had set up to process these immigrants. And just waves and waves and waves of immigrants just completely overwhelm the system. And these immigrants show up. Most of them are illiterate. Very few of them speak English. And there's many stories about Ellis Island where, these immigrants would show up with these like unpronounceably Eastern European names. And these poor clerks just couldn't handle it. The poor clerk had been behind this desk for 9-10 hours. And then suddenly this guy shows up from Poland. And the American goes, well, what's your name? Well, I'm Dmitry Bezestakevich. And the American just kind of blinks and writes down, okay, Dennis Brown. So a lot of these immigrants' names got changed as they entered the country. And a lot of these immigrants changed their own names because they wanted to leave the old country behind. And they're showing up in very large numbers in New York just in time to see a giant copper statue welcoming them. And we'll get to this giant lady in just a tick. Because America both loved and hated these immigrants. Now, we love the influx of immigrants. We love their work ethic. We love their ingenuity. We love their ability to work long hours for little pay. And you can see that in the cartoon right up there at the top. There's Uncle Sam. His arms are wide open. He's standing in front of the U.S. Ark of Refuge. And on the horizon, the evil storm clouds of Europe as he welcomes the immigrants with open arms. People from Poland and Greece and Britain. No oppressive taxes, no expensive kings, no compulsory military service. Welcome all to America. So America, on one hand, loves these new immigrants, and it welcomes them. There is Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty herself, who was erected in the early 1880s. And that's how she originally looked, before she was green. She was made out of a brilliant copper. And now she was paid for by the Americans and built by the French, and the plinth was constructed in New York Harbor. And she was originally intended to be a celebration of the centenary of the American and the French revolutions. But so many immigrants are pouring underneath the arms of Lady Liberty that basically she becomes almost rededicated to immigration. And this is evident in the poem that is inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. An American poet, Emma Lazarus, writes the following words, celebrating the arrival of these new immigrants. And this is what that giant copper lady says to the people coming to Ellis Island, the 9 million people processed at Ellis Island. She says, "Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Emma Lazarus, 1883. And if you had people that showed up at this point in time from Italy or the old country or Russia or Poland or Germany, and they came through Ellis Island in the 1880s and 1890s, they passed under the welcoming arm of Lady Liberty herself. But, like I said, America loves these new immigrants, but at the same time, America hates these new immigrants. And here are anti-immigration cartoons from the late 19th century. America also hated the immigrants, disliked the labor, it disliked their ingenuity, and it disliked the competition it brought to native workers. They liked the hardworking immigrants, but why did they have to be so foreign? It disliked the foreignness of their culture. I mean, they're showing up with all this weird food and pasta and marinara and borscht and gefilte fish. It's just weird stuff. And so America loves, but America hates these immigrants at the same time. And this love-hate relationship persists the entire time of the industrial age and arguably persists to this very day. And you can see it in these cartoons there on the left. That's a very unhappy Uncle Sam, very different Uncle Sam from the previous cartoon. There he is. He's dreaming of William McKinley there in the upper left. And there are the immigrants. You can see they're being dumped on American shores. And it says on that container, direct from the slums of Europe daily. And it's picturing these Italian immigrants as basically rats, as vermin that are being dumped on the shore of America, bringing wildness and the mafia and socialism and all these crazy ideas. And there's the cartoon on the lower left that shows well-dressed, prosperous Americans saying no to the immigrants, the poor immigrants showing up. But behind those well-dressed Americans are the shadows that shows that they were once too impoverished immigrants. There's only a small number of immigrants from China, but they prove key. I mean, they mostly build the railroads of the Wild West. But America really doesn't like the Chinese immigrants. They're just too foreign. They're too odd. So although the percentages are quite small, it is the Chinese immigrants who will face the most significant and the most violent opposition when they arrive in the United States. Now, all these people start showing up, and there is a considerable apprehension that all of these new immigrants are not really going to think of themselves as Americans. They're still going to have this kind of love for the old country. And there is a push to teach the children of these immigrants that they are, in fact, American. In fact, they're going to make them swear a pledge that they are, in fact, American. So all these immigrant children start showing up in American schools, and the idea is that these people have to be taught to be American. So one of the first things they start doing in these schools is make them recite a pledge of allegiance to the United States. And this idea comes in 1887 as a guy named George Balch, who was an old Civil War veteran. He fought on the North, of course. And he decided that immigrant children should be required to recite a pledge to the country. Now, the original pledge changes a couple times, and eventually they settle on a pledge written by a local reverend named Francis Bellamy. And that's the pledge up there in the left. And it is the original Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The under God thing gets added much, much later. But please note, one nation indivisible. That's the old Civil War veterans of the North throwing a little shade on the South, because the United States will not break up. The South tried that. And when I say that these huge new American cities explode, these cities explode. I mean, they become gigantic. I mean, New York City triples in size from 1.1 million to 3.4 million. I mean, look at Philly. It goes from, 500,000 to, 1.2 million people, more than doubling in size. Baltimore more than doubles, goes from 200,000 to 500,000. St. Louis goes from 160,000 to 500,000. But the city that really explodes, the city that becomes the second largest city in the United States, Chicago. Look at the increase of Chicago. 1860, Chicago had 100,000 people in it. 40 years later, 1.6 million. Second largest city in the United States. Chicago increased by a factor of 16. These are massive new cities. The country had never seen anything like this. And the American cities were completely and totally unprepared for this movement of people. The immigrant poor, either from rural America or from, the immigrants arriving from Europe, crowded into these dark and crumbling neighborhoods, into these huge, packed and filthy apartment buildings called tenements. And that's what a tenement looked like in the 1880s and 1890s. These crowded, decaying, rapidly, cheaply built brick buildings, sometimes averaging 8 to 12 people per bedroom. They would just stack the beds to the ceiling. Now, tenements are these dense apartment buildings, generally with shared entrances and shared bathrooms. And this is the part that tends to freak out a lot of students. And here is a drawing of what these tenement buildings looked like. These 5, 6, 7-story buildings with just whole families packed into 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. Just massive tenements. They're built very quickly. They're built very rapidly. They're not built well, and they're not built for comfort. If you were lucky, each floor of your tenement would have a single shared bathroom. So you would have about 8 or 9 apartments per floor. Each apartment is having like 1 or 2 families, and all of these families are sharing a single bathroom on that floor of the apartment. And that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, there are no bathrooms. If you're unlucky, the bathroom is behind the building in a set of privies, either in an alley or in an empty lot behind the building. And these are really hard places to live in. But again, it's better than getting chased by Cossacks across Imperial Russia. And most of the time you're in the meatpacking plant anyway. or in the textile mill. Now, inside these slums, disease and crime were rampant. Large areas of these slums were not really controlled by police or by the city government, which were completely overwhelmed by the explosion of their cities. But most of these neighborhoods were controlled by brutal street gangs that had these kind of weird and colorful names, like the Wyos, or the 5 Points Gang, or the very infamous gang of New York City, the Dead Rabbits. And a really good history has been written about these big violent street gangs. Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York. But New York just had the largest and most violent gangs. Every major city had these gangs. And while these street gangs were really quite brutal, I mean, they were organized criminal enterprises, the thing is that the gangs actually provided peace and security for these neighborhoods in a way that the overwhelmed police forces just couldn't. For instance, you know, if you're living in one of these tenements and your sister is working in a textile mill, and you've got some guy who's creeping on your sister, there's no point in going to the police because they're not going to hear you. But you can go to the Dead Rabbits. You know, there's some dead rabbits right there. You can go to the Dead Rabbits and you can say, this guy's been creeping on my sister. And they will go, we'll take care of it. We'll talk to him. All right. And that guy will either be convinced to leave your sister alone, or he will be beaten quite severely because they are criminals. But they're criminals. So if they do a favor for you, you're going to do a favor for them. So they might have saved your sister from getting creeped on, but there might be a knock on the door. You open it and there's the Dead Rabbits, and they're like, we need to help. You need to haul some bodies and dump them in the East River. And you're going to put on your coat and do it. So while these were, organized criminal enterprises, they did kind of maintain a rough sense of peace and security in the neighborhoods they controlled, because they did get stuff done. And there you go. There's a drawing on the upper left. That's what one of these slum tenement neighborhoods looked like. And these places were rough places to live. They lacked sanitation. They lacked sewers. They often lacked clean drinking water. They lacked ready access to hospitals. Disease was intensely common inside these tenement slums. And disease was really common inside these huge new cities. I mean, that on the lower left is a list of all of the disease epidemics in New York City from 1864 to 1918. Basically, and in that period between 1864 and 1918, New York City experienced a major disease epidemic every 3 years. Typhus, smallpox, meningitis, diphtheria again, more smallpox, and there we go, a slew of meningitis. And of course, all of this culminates in one of the worst disease epidemics in recorded history, the Spanish flu of 1918. So there you go, picture a major COVID outbreak every 3 years, and that's what living in these major cities was like. City services were basically non-existent. The police are completely overwhelmed. Fire departments were completely overwhelmed. Everything was completely overwhelmed. So when you were unemployed, when you were injured, when you were hungry, when you were arrested, when you got cheated, ordinary people had no recourse. They had to turn to something that was new, something called a political machine. This is how a political machine worked. Look at the little circles right up above my head. So local people vote for these machine candidates, all right? And the machine takes over the local government and elects a party boss, and that's the party boss on the upper left. The party boss then controls elected officials and city workers, and the party boss hands out jobs and favors to local people, and in return, local people vote for the machine candidate. So, like, what is a political machine? It's not a literal machine. It is an organization of corrupt politicians. Political machines were, and are, because they're still around, they are extra-legal organizations that will trade favors for votes, all right? A political machine will take care of you, all right? If you're out of a job, if you're hungry, you can go to the party boss, and he will feed you. He will make sure that you've got a job somewhere. But in return, you and your entire family and all of your friends are going to vote for him. And in return, they are going to cheat the city. They are going to steal a little taxes. They're going to skim a little bit off the side. They're going to cut deals with these criminal gangs like the Dead Rabbits or the Wyos or the 5 Points. The political machine is a corrupt political organization, but it did deliver city services. I mean, it did kind of work. And these political machines became spectacularly corrupt, dispensing jobs, offices, and contracts, not to people who actually knew how to do it, not to capable people, but often to people who were loyal to the machine. So, the city wants to hire 50 sanitation workers. The party boss isn't going to hire 50 people who are really dedicated and know what they're doing in terms of sanitation. He's going to hire 50 people that can deliver votes. So the result is that these sanitation departments get packed with people that don't really know what they're doing. These party bosses and these political machines worked hat in hand with organized crime, often leaning on police to look the other way when the gangs and the mafia would work. They would often steal ballot boxes. They would fill out votes for non-existent or deceased voters. One of the more infamous things they would do is tell all the men in a neighborhood, to not shave in the months leading up to an election. They would take all of these men with big bushy beards into the polls. All of them would vote. Then they would take these several hundred men to a barber shop, shave them so that they look completely different, and then take them back to vote again. All right? And they would often go into cemeteries and record names and give these names of people in the cemeteries so people could vote 2 or even 3 or even 4 times. The most infamously corrupt political machine of the era was one called Tammany Hall in New York City. And Tammany Hall was a spectacularly corrupt machine with the undisputed king of New York. There he is right up above me, Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was the king of New York. He wasn't mayor, but he ran that city for 20 years. He was the political boss of the machine called Tammany Hall. Boss Tweed picked out who the mayor was going to be. He picked out who the governor of New York was going to be. He directed Italian street gangs. He directed Irish street gangs. If a street gang didn't want to be hassled by police, Boss Tweed would call in the police chief, the police commissioner, and say, "You're going to not put any cops in this part of town for the next week or so." Boss Tweed became the criminal mastermind of New York City. And there's actually a fantastic board game. If you're into board games, I can't recommend this game highly enough. It's a really fun game. The board is a map of New York City, in 1880. And the point of the game is to become Boss Tweed, the king of New York, the head of Tammany Hall, the criminal mastermind of the Big Apple. It's a really fun game. You have to slander your opponents. It's great. But Boss Tweed is instrumental in many of the things that happen in New York City during this period. And indeed, he's instrumental in helping build one of the great engineering marvels of the day, the Brooklyn Bridge. And the Brooklyn Bridge is built between 1870 and 1883. And Tweed personally bribed city officials who were opposed to the bridge. They said the bridge is too expensive, it's too daring, it's not going to work. And literally, Boss Tweed would knock on their door at midnight, walk in, have brandy and cigars with them, and casually leave a suitcase of money. All right? And there's no questioning what Boss Tweed wanted them to do. Because Boss Tweed wanted to run the project, because Boss Tweed wanted to steal from the Brooklyn Bridge project. And he stole so much money from the Brooklyn Bridge project. Boss Tweed personally bribed city officials who opposed the bridge. He got the project to buy inferior stone from his suppliers that eventually had to be replaced. He got them to hire his personal gangsters to work on the bridge. Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed stole somewhere around $6 million from the Brooklyn Bridge project. But he kept the project alive. And it is indeed one of the reasons that it was so dangerous and it took 13 years to build. Because the whole time, Boss Tweed is ripping off the bridge project. But he builds the bridge. I mean, it's there. And the Brooklyn Bridge really is an engineering marvel. It was the largest and most elaborate bridge in the world. It was built by tunneling into the river. People had to go down. They discovered what pressure sickness was because of the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And it really is an engineering marvel of the time, and it is one of the jewels of New York City. You know, and we expect bridges to be like a thing today, but Brooklyn Bridge is one of the great bridges of America, and it's one of the engineering marvels of the age. And inside these huge new cities, fires were frequent, fires were deadly, and fires were often very badly handled. Again, you would have these huge numbers of badly built, rapidly built tenement buildings, and they could be right next to like a steel mill. There wasn't any safety inspections. There was no zoning restrictions. There wasn't even like really professional firefighters. Often your fire department was made up of volunteers. So by the time a fire broke out, you got your firefighters together, you know, that building is already being consumed by flames. And these flames would rapidly sweep through entire areas at once and burn up the people inside. So it is no surprise that virtually every major American city burns to the ground during this period. And we have major American fires. There on the upper left, that's the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, where almost the entire city burned to the ground. There's the Great Boston Fire of 1872, the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, and the king of these is the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. And it wasn't the earthquake that was that bad, even though the earthquake was quite bad, but the earthquake triggered a fire. And the fire swept through San Francisco in 1906. And that picture on the left is post-earthquake San Francisco. I mean, it's just devastated, all right? But it wasn't even the worst thing that happened in this period, because this period also sees the worst natural disaster in American history. The Galveston Hurricane of 1900. Now, it's not a huge fire. It is just a monster storm. A huge hurricane comes out of the Gulf of Mexico and slams into Galveston, Texas, basically obliterating most of the city. And this is going to kind of surprise you, and it's going to surprise a lot of people in Texas, but Galveston used to be the largest, wealthiest, and most important city in Texas. For most of the 19th century, Texas revolves around Galveston, but not after 1900, because the Galveston Hurricane basically erases Galveston as a city, forcing the entire city to be rebuilt. In fact, they raised the entire city like 12 feet or something. But the hurricane comes in and there's no city services, there's no flood wall. The city is just completely overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. And it's the worst natural disaster in American history. More than 8,000 people are killed when the hurricane just erases Galveston from the map. And all of this put together, the increase of the huge cities, this influx of industrial wealth, the movement from the countryside into the cities, all of this creates a brand new American society, an unusual social hierarchy that we call a class structure. And a class structure is a society where your position within the internal hierarchy is determined by this mix of education, income, wealth, attitudes, and a mix of cultural and behavioral indicators. And there is the new American society that emerges at the end of the 19th century, where you basically have this tiered approach that ranges all the way from the ultra rich all the way to the underclass. And I'm going to describe each of these very, very briefly. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but we're going to spend a little amount of time on this. At the very bottom, you had the underclass. These are people who struggle with jobs. They're either partially employed or they're not employed. They're struggling with some sort of alcohol or drug addiction or really bad health problems. That is the underclass. People who are constantly on the edge of destitution and poverty. People that are just basically in survival mode, trying to get from one day to the next. That's the underclass. There isn't a tremendous amount of these people, but they are in very, very hard conditions. They're a very harsh way. Above them, you have the working class. These are the people who worked in the steel mills, in the coal mines, on the farms, in the textile mills. They're the working class, and they made up roughly about half of all Americans in this period. They wore denim, they wore work boots, they worked 11 to 12 hours a day, in power looms or in coal mines or at Bessemer furnaces. And the working class really is driving change during this period. But above the working class, you have the middle class. And this is kind of a middle managerial class. They're the people who are working as inspectors, managers, secretaries. They're working in the banks. They're working as lawyers. And as you can see right up above me, these are people who live in, they live in their own homes or semi-detached houses. They've got a very comfortable way of living. They're emulating the behaviors and emulating the style of the upper class, but they're not really rich enough to be the upper class. And above them, you have the upper class. These are the people who live a life of wealth and comfort. This is the factory owners. These are the people that own the tenements. These are the people deeply involved in the political machine. These are the people that ate well and dressed well and lived in nice, really fancy houses. And above the upper class, you have the ultra rich. We'll get to the ultra rich in just a bit. But the thing about, this sort of tiered social order, the underclass, the working class, the middle class, the upper class, and the ultra rich, this 5-tiered social system, is that this forms towards the end of the 19th century, but this is the current class structure in American society today. The differences have changed a little bit. Back in the 1880s and 1890s, roughly half of all people were working class. And, you can see right up above me, today it's only about a third of Americans are working class and a third of them are middle class. But this is the exact same class structure we have today. And you can see it not just in income levels, but in behaviors and levels of income. Working class people wear denim, baseball hats, drink canned beer, and are into NASCAR and football. Middle class people live in single family homes. They tend to drink highballs. They tend to have gone to college, and they have some sort of white collar job. And then you've got the upper class. They're drinking brandy and very nice whiskeys, and they went to Yale or Harvard or any of those super frou-frou schools in the Northeast. This is the same class structure we have today. In fact, if you really want to understand modern American politics and modern American culture, you must understand the American class structure. And Americans don't really like to talk about class structure because we sort of see ourselves as very egalitarian people. And to some extent, we kind of go to great efforts to hide our economic class. But it doesn't mean it's not there. And indeed, if you would want to understand contemporary politics at all, you must understand it from a class perspective. But again, this is something pretty new in American society. In the 1870s and 1880s, this is something that's new. This American society used to be rural. It used to be based in, used to be regional, not sort of this tiered hierarchy. So at the same time that this class structure forms, a lot of people view this class structure as something that is deeply un-American. Americans have always thought of themselves in very egalitarian terms. All men are created equal. And the great disparity of wealth coming at the end of the 19th century caused a great deal of concern. And it attracted considerable criticism. I mean, there's a drawing you can see. Literally, the working class is putting a fist through the floor to get to the ultra rich right up on top. And what was seen as especially un-American was the great ostentation of the ultra wealthy, the richy riches, who often flaunted their wealth and flaunted their achievements. These are the people at the very tippy top of the class structure. And they flaunted it. They flaunted their wealth. They dressed in beautiful dresses. They built beautiful mansions. They went to dinner. They drank expensive French and Spanish wines. They flaunted their wealth. They had beautiful palaces, sumptuous dinners, luxurious rooms, stunning tuxedos, gorgeous gowns, rare wines, fine foods, huge mansions. elaborate marriages. We'll go into the marriages in a bit. And one of the things that emerges that these really ultra wealthy Americans start to import and start to build in America are strange new machines just for their own leisure. These bizarre things called automobiles. They began to produce cars. Now, this is going to be weird, but originally, back in the 1890s, these first cars were seen as un-American. You know, they see these ultra wealthy people driving around, you know, in the Chicago Benton Harbor Autocycle or the Packard 4-passenger. And many people say that's un-American. That's un-American. Americans are into cowboys and horses. These are these toys of the ultra rich, and it's just them flaunting the wealth. And you have people in the 1890s that are saying Americans will reject the automobile. We'll never have it. And then Henry Ford comes along and changes their opinion. But yeah, this is the very first American cars begin to emerge as the playthings of these really wealthy people. And they absolutely flaunted their wealth. And they would have these massive, elaborate parties. This is one of the most ostentatious and decadent parties ever thrown in American history. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883. At the Vanderbilt Mansion in downtown Manhattan, this huge mansion the guy builds in the middle of the most expensive real estate in the world, in which all of his rich friends and all of the ultra rich Americans showed up, and they dressed in elaborate costumes, dressing up as, you know, medieval heroes, as figures from the Italian Renaissance. People dressed up like French aristocrats. And here is a dress by one of the Vanderbilt girls, her golden gown. The gown is not only partially yellow silk and gold thread, but it was electrified. And she somebody would carry around a battery behind her because her dress would light up. And this is another one of those love and hate relationships. Americans hated this. They hated it. It was ostentatious. It was gross. It was a vulgar display of wealth. But they also kind of loved it too. They loved reading about the marriages of the Vanderbilts and their affairs and their divorces and who's with who and who's dressing up as what. So Americans developed not only a love and hate relationship with immigrants, but they developed this love and hate relationship with the ultra wealthy Americans that emerge in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. They're kind of fascinated with these people, but repelled by them at the same time. Because these people are not old money. All of this money was made like in the last 20 or 30 years. And this posed a problem for the really wealthy Americans. Because after all, they're only a generation or two removed from abject poverty. In fact, remember that 12-year-old Scottish boy who showed up completely penniless in America, Andrew Carnegie. By the time we get to 1870, 1880, he's become one of the richest men in America. He founds a company called Carnegie Steel and becomes one of the great robber barons of American history. But he doesn't come from an old family. He's not from old money. You know, he showed up penniless. And so what a lot of these really rich American families want is they want an aristocratic past. They want to acquire the patina of old wealth. So what they do is they begin to start this phenomenon called dollar princesses. And what a dollar princess is these rich American families right up there will basically marry off their daughter to these storied British aristocratic families, you know, back in the UK. These aristocrats back in Britain, they had the name, they had the family history, you know, their family goes back 800 years. But what these British families don't have is money. And that's what the Americans have. So you have this exchange of the daughters of rich Americans going to England and marrying the sons of these impoverished British aristocrats. And these are the dollar princesses. And often these dollar princesses were just told straight up, you are going to go to Europe and you are going to marry Lord X and you are going to become Lady X, and you're going to do this to make our family look good. So the rich families of America basically sold off their daughters to British aristocrats. The Americans got to say, yeah, my brother-in-law, he's a Duke of Cornwall, you know. And the Duke of Cornwall got that sweet American money. The most famous dollar princess of the period was, of course, Consuelo Vanderbilt over there, who was married in 1910. But the most important of all of these dollar princesses is not Consuelo Vanderbilt. It's Jenny Jerome. And there she is, getting married at age 20. Beautiful woman. Jenny Jerome, she grows up in this very wealthy banking family in New York. She's something of a wild child in her teenage years. She likes to stay up drinking. She smokes cigars. She has a tattoo of a cat, I think, on her ankle. Or was it a snake? Anyway, I don't remember. She's a bit of a wild child, and her family has had enough of her. Her family grabs Jenny Jerome, and they say, you, we are going to marry you to a British aristocrat, because it's going to make our family look really good to be related to these British aristocrats. You get to do something good for your family because we're tired of you staying and partying out all night, drinking and smoking cigars and getting tattoos. Or we are going to cut you off and kick you out of the family. And Jenny Jerome agrees. She says, okay, I'll marry this guy. And so she basically marries this guy 3 days after she meets him. And she becomes the most influential dollar princess. Her husband is a guy called Randolph Spencer Churchill, who is, I think, a bit older than her. And he looks a bit like a frog. But she's important because she gives her husband a couple sons, and they grow up in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900. And she always kind of resents the fact that she was kind of sold to this British royal family, this British aristocratic family. She resents it a great deal. So when her sons grow up, she tells them stories about America, about cowboys, about Theodore Roosevelt. And her little kids grow up with these stories of the Wild West and the gangs of New York, and they grow up with this real admiration and love of America because her oldest son is Winston Churchill. Andrew Carnegie again. Andrew Carnegie, who showed up in 1848 with not 2 pennies to rub together. By the time we get to 1890, is one of the richest men in America. And he builds that mansion. And that is only one of about 10 mansions he has. The important thing is it sits on 4 acres in downtown Manhattan. All right. And that is his front room. And this is just the house he uses when he's in New York. Beautiful, beautiful house. It's still there, by the way. And you can actually visit, Andrew Carnegie's New York house, which is in the middle of downtown Manhattan, surrounded by skyscrapers. And they showed off their wealth. They flaunted their wealth. And some of these mansions are still there. Here is a Gilded Age Mansion, which became available. And if you've got $50 million, you can still buy it. And here's the real estate listing. This is probably the closest I'll ever get to being inside a house like this. I mean, just look at the wealth and the ostentation. Marble bathrooms, Renaissance paintings on the walls, gold filigree on the tables, incredible displays, vulgar displays of wealth. And, if you've got $50 million you can loan me, maybe we can we can share the mansion. It's fine. So where did all of this money come from exactly? How did Andrew Carnegie go from this penniless Scottish immigrant into one of the wealthiest men in the country? And it came through the application and the formation of trusts and monopolies, through vertical integration, horizontal integration, brutal competition, and the formation of monopolistic trusts. But we'll get into that next time. And I will see you there.